This is Dead Serious, a show about short horror stories worthy of discussion. I'm Dead Palette, and it's Halloween month, Kitty Cup. Today we're taking a look at another 15 hours creepypasta. This one is entitled, The Graveyard in Korea. Let's get right into it. I found that title interesting. I want to know what's going on. I guess I should start with some background. I'm in the military. I'll leave out the branch out. But of course, not without allusion, we're the best despite being the most underpaid. My friend who this story involves, I'll give him the pseudonym of Garcia. He probably hate that, but that's just how our friendship goes. This all took place in South Korea. The story I'm about to tell is honestly 100% true. Alright, a lot of the stuff that we need to get out of the way is gotten out of the way in the first paragraph, and I like that. Not a whole lot to say just yet, but I do like what has been built. When we arrived in Korea, we paired up with a Korean unit whose numbers matched our own. The purpose was mainly to refine tactical skills, so we spent a lot of time training with the Koreans. One of the training areas contains a more or less graveyard. I'm going to say that again because I want to make sure that I'm reading it 100% correctly. One of the training areas contains a more or less graveyard. Something about that doesn't sound right. I don't think that that's grammatically correct. In this wooded area, graves were spread out and only appeared in small but noticeably taller than the ground mounds of dirt. And of course, like every graveyard foreign to you, you'll hear of how it's haunted, and you'll have less than intelligent people buy into every story they hear. Well, this graveyard is supposedly a place where large numbers of people were slaughtered. One of the stories unique to this area is that throughout the night, you could hear the shrill screams of the slaughtered. Alright, so far the language is feeling a little bit clunky, although I understand the general meaning of what is trying to be conveyed, and it doesn't give the impression that the person writing this is someone involved with armed forces. That is something that I think a lot of authors who have been in armed forces are very successful at getting you involved in that milieu and in that kind of jargon, and I would like to see a little bit more of that, so let's see how this goes. Every night, the roster is made for pairs of individuals to stand guard while the others slept. The Koreans would return to the barracks of their own every night. Should be of their own volition? I don't know, the language here is just weird. Okay. While we slept in tents organized into small areas. Since we were in a small area, generally free of threat, we would have one pair of rovers posted every hour, and they would be relieved on the hour. After a couple nights in, you would hear guys exchange stories about how they heard the screams and the common embellishment that they heard more than just that, which Garcia and myself would always just brush off. We never had heard anything that didn't even deem it necessary for explanation. It was just the power of suggestion at work. After a long day of extensive training, it was time to set up the nightly watch roster. Garcia and myself caught a night shift a couple of hours past midnight. We liked to regard ourselves as two of the better infantrymen we were with. And so we lived this up with a level of stupid pride and machismo. Okay, I'm not crazy here, right? The grammar is really fucking off here. We like to regard ourselves as two of the better infantrymen we were with. So the two of you, just the two of you, were the best infantrymen of those two infantrymen. What? And we lived this up with a level of stupid pride and machismo. Lived this up. That's so weird, right? Okay. I cannot, it's just so weird. Anyway, we were excited to stand that hour creepily in the middle of the night and hopefully experience some of these hauntings and, in essence, debunked them. Before we racked out prior to our shift, we hung out in our 2-man tent and exchanged creepy ghost stories we created. Okay, so I feel like we're kind of wasting words here. There's not a whole lot going on yet, until maybe the last 2 sentences of that paragraph where you can kind of get a sense of what's going on. These 2 are trying to make up ghost stories because they're bored and because they think that they are unique among the other infantrymen. I think that that's cool. When it is time for our shift, one of the rovers peeked into our tent and woke me up. I, in turn, kicked Garcia and told him it was our turn. He groggily mumbled something entirely incomprehensible, but it was enough entirely incomprehensible like the grammar in the story, but it was enough to let me know he was awake. I decided that I would go to the 2 rovers and that he'd be right behind me. Well, I was partially right at least. About 2 minutes later, he was in tow and came to my side. There were 2 makeshift stools set up in the middle of the tent city, and you would generally do a lap and then sit for a minute. We silently did our lap, which I attributed to the sleepiness that made our way to the stools. We sat down and shot the shit for a few minutes, just mindless small talk, and that's when it happened. I heard the single most blood-curdling scream I had ever heard. I immediately jumped up on the alert and tightened the grip on my rifle. I frantically looked around to wherever I heard the scream, and it was straight into the most densely wooded area in this graveyard-strewn forest. Garcia sat there with his aloofness, glanced at me, and started laughing. For me, that was creepy enough. I turned back to him. "What the fuck are you laughing at?" I said, actually starting to anger. He looked over to the direction of the scream, back at me, and said, "That was a fucking bird. I heard one just like that back home, stupid." That was calming, so I looked back to the woods and sat back down. Okay, so I'm kind of confused here because this is supposed to be a skeptical person who is trying to debunk these stories and isn't scared and everything. It's weird that he would be so quick to anger and freak out over this. That's a little weird tonally. In terms of the situation, they're trying to establish what the routine is, and I think that it's a little unclear in the language that they've used, but I like the idea of them trying to tell you how their rounds go, what they do when they're roving around and everything. Anyway, I sat there and in between conversation, I began to notice how eerily silent it was. It occasionally made the hair on the back of my neck stand. We got back up and did our lap. Halfway through, as we neared the side of the woods, where a thick patch of forest was, Garcia kept insisting that we ought to check it out, just to complete the experience. If there was one thing I was adamant about at this point, it was staying the fuck out of that patch. That's weird, because I would assume that you would need to stay out of that patch just in terms of that's not on your routine of stuff you're supposed to do. Anyway, he started to get mad at me, which happened occasionally. We were both very stubborn, but every time we roved by, he would always bring it up, and his anger increased each time we passed it, until he decided to change his approach. He tried to challenge my manliness, which normally works, but not tonight. I told him we could look tomorrow morning, which was met with cold silence. We sat back down, our shift almost over, and I could feel his anger for not checking it out tonight. Some weird, tense shifting issues there. But they're kind of talking about the general machismo of the military and challenging someone's manliness and that kind of culture. I think that that's something that this story needs more of. It needs to focus on those kinds of things. I've read some pretty compelling creepypastas and ashcan horror stories revolving around the military and the culture therein, because when you live in that, and that's something that you get very invested in, it's hard to, it's not hard to convey that in a story. that ends up being your life. And they always say, the saying is write what you know. If you just live in the military, then that's what you know. So we went to wake up the next pair of guys and came back to the stools. He tried to get me to go one last time since our relief was about to come anyway, and I again told him no. This was met with a heated argument, me leaving him with a fuck you and walking back to our tent. I unzipped the tent and saw something inside. I quickly flipped on the light on my rifle and put it back wherever was in there. I quickly flipped the light on my rifle and put it on wherever was in there. Wow. Garcia slept inside. In a panic motion, I glanced back over to the stools. There sat a man who was no longer Garcia. Not even really a man. I mean, it looked human, but that head was terrifying. It was egg-shaped, and I don't mean how some people's heads have the shape of an upside-down egg. I mean, it looked like a goddamn egg, right side up. It was slightly larger than a normal head should be. Shaped as aforementioned, but featureless. There were no eyes. There was no ears, no mouth, no nose, no anything. Just pale. That notebook paper white. It just faced me. I'm sure in some context you can make a monster like what is being so described here scary, but instead what I'm getting out of this is actually just kind of funny. Mr. Egghead Monster. Oh my god, it's so ridiculous. Then it happened again. That fucking shriek. My eyes tore away from that thing for a second to look back at the patch. As soon as I looked back over, it was gone. It took off toward the stools. Nothing. I climbed on top of them and surveyed the small camp. Nothing amiss, except one fucking unzipped tent. Tent unzipped. There we go, Brandon. That's the order that those words are written right there. I hauled my ass over to it, but it was the only tent of the two relief rovers. I made my way back to the tent. Everything was normal. Everything was normal everywhere. I mean, the silence was gone. Nature made its noises. I heard snores of my brothers in arms. Everything was fucking normal. Man, I just can't get over the weird grammar and its inability to ground this ridiculous monster of Egghead. And I'm sure a lot of people are going to draw comparisons to Slender Man off this, which I don't think is accurate because Slender Man is a man in a suit with no face, and this is a fucking egg. And of course, the egg doesn't have a face, but still. I woke Garcia up and told him everything. He thought I was messing with him and went back to sleep. I couldn't sleep. I unzipped part of the tent to reveal a mesh net and stared into the patch until the sun came up. We left that training site that morning. After that, after Garcia saw how disheveled I was, he finally believed me. Once we made our way back to one of the main bases in Japan, I was freaked out enough that where I had known it was just me. I'm going to state this again because I'm kind of baffled. I was freaked out enough where I had to know if it was just me. Okay, no, it was me that time, not the story. Okay. My own accord and unknown to my own accord and on my own accord and unknown to my unit, I went through a whole health evaluation and everything checks out. Nothing spooky or paranormal has happened to me since that night, but damn, does that shit give me nightmares sometimes. I guess it really is haunted all along. I'm going to say that again. I guess it really is haunted all along. Credit to G.P. Joe. So ultimately I think that this story fails on a lot of surface level stuff, and it's the crux of the story, which I think is easy to overlook because of how ridiculous the Egghead monster is. Let's try and switch it up and tell the bare facts of this story. There is a man who is in the military. and he's on a base in South Korea. And in South Korea, him and his friend do these nightly roving guarding positions. And on the outskirts of this base, this makeshift base, there are haunted grounds and a graveyard and everything. One night, him and his infantry mate are roving around doing their normal patrol, and his infantry mate keeps trying to get him to go into the woods. Daring him to do it, essentially challenging his manhood, all of these things. And at the end of his shift, he goes back to the tent and sees that his friend is really in the tent, and that the person that he's been roving around with is actually some kind of monster who is trying to tempt him to go into the woods all alone. Presumably, this monster lives in those woods and would be able to kill him or do something terrible to him in the woods, make him disappear. When I tell the story like that, I think it sounds a lot more compelling than the way that the story was actually told, and I think that that speaks volumes of the writing prowess involved here. I think that the person who wrote this story had a cool concept, but I think they really flubbed it on execution. That said, I'm curious to know what you think. Now, if you enjoyed that, please consider helping out the community and supporting my channel. You can support the community by conversing in the comments below, going to toospooky.com for original horror stories, and trying your hand at short horror yourself. You can support me by liking this video, following me on Twitter and Tumblr, links in the description, and checking out my art page, which is also down below. Thank you so much for your time, and now on to our sponsor at this non-moment in time, which is Junior Mints. Junior Mints. They look like little flattened deer turds.